Hi and welcome to the first part of our presentation today for the annual white tea event. My name's Godden, otherwise known as the Devotea, and I've decided to do some of this presentation via video, and the reason for that is satellite technology is a little unreliable and I'm a fast talking Australian. So the idea is that we'll start with 2 video presentations, and then if technology works I will pop on live to chat to you all and see how it's going. And what we're doing today is presenting a couple of blends. Now, the postal services all being what they should be, those blends should be being enjoyed by you today. And what I'd like to do is talk you through why those blends exist. Because tea is about stories. There's a story behind everything, and most of the blends in the tea world are blended for consistency or for price. So basically what we want is a cheap tea that always tastes the same. And that's really not where I come from, and it's really not what I believe tea to be about. So sometimes I create blends around tastes, and sometimes I create them around stories. What we've got for you today is 2 blends that are created especially for this event and for their story value. So we're going to start with the first blend, and that is called Reflection. And Reflection is a blend of black teas, and the reason we have got a blend called Reflection today is that it's so easy for us to just drink a cup of tea without reflecting, without thinking about what's gone into putting that tea on our plate. So what I'd like to do is take you through some stories and why those stories are important to me and how they've found their way into your cup. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you an ancient Chinese proverb, and the proverb, which makes very little sense, goes along these lines. It is, "Old Sai loses a horse." And that random collection of words means to anybody who knows the story a fairly significant point, and that is that not everything, or everything, is neither all bad nor all good. And so the story goes as follows. In a village there is a man called Sai, and he's called Old Sai, presumably because he's old, or perhaps he just has a younger son also called Sai. But regardless, this is Old Sai we're talking about. Now, Old Sai has a horse, and one day it runs away. And all the villagers say, well, this is a total calamity. This is a disaster. He had a horse, now he hasn't. It's a terrible, terrible thing. But then a week later, the horse turns up and it brings a mate back with it. So now he has 2 horses. So the villagers again are very totalitarian in their belief. It is a fantastic thing. It is all good. He had 1 horse, now he has 2. That is a wonderful event. And then his son, possibly the young Sai we postulated about earlier, jumps on the new horse for a bit of a ride and gets thrown off and breaks his leg. And again the villagers have gone down the road of, this is a total calamity, this is the worst thing that can happen, his son is now crippled, he won't be able to help him on the farm as much, it's all a tragedy. And then 6 months later the army comes through the village conscripting able-bodied men, but because young Sai has a crippled leg, he is allowed to stay behind and not taken off to war. And the villagers again go down this idea of saying, oh, that's all fantastic, that's a great event. And the purpose of that parable is to say that not everything is good or bad, but it has some good and some bad to it. And my cufflinks, which you probably can't see, are actually a hot tap and a cold tap. And I always like to think of the fact that water, if it's all heat, it's steam, and if it's all cold, it's ice. It's not that useful in either form compared to when it's got some warmth and some cold. So to celebrate the story of Old Sai and the idea that when we reflect, we have to think not everything is good, not everything is bad, there's a mixture there. I've included this. This is a Keema Malfeng. So it's a nice Chinese black tea from the area where that proverb's anticipated to have originated from. And so that's I've put that in the blend you've got in front of you to represent that story. And the idea that not everything is, or nothing is completely good or completely bad. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about New York. You're in New York. What a marvellously mythic place New York is. It's on our TV screens here, and we see it in glorious technicolor, and it's a place of smart-witted people sitting around in coffee shops discussing all manner of things, and it makes us laugh. And it's also the scene of horrific murders where the bodies get buried in upstate New York. It's one thing I've learned from SVU. It's everyone's always buried in upstate New York, wherever that is. Now, New York is really important in the story of tea, and it's mostly important for two gentlemen called Sullivan, both of New York. I want to talk about Richard Sullivan. Richard Sullivan was famous for what he did in New York, though he was a apothecary from Hull in England. And what he did was he put together a blend of tea, and the name that he gave it still resonates. He called it English breakfast tea. English breakfast tea was invented in New York. Now it's totally different to what it is now. It was a lot greener. It was mostly green tea with a little pinch of this and that. But that name has graced so many packets, and it is just such an evocative name, and it's a really, really interesting idea. And poor old Mr. Sullivan, he died broke. Now the other Mr. Sullivan is Thomas Sullivan, who was a tea merchant, and he made the decision in the first decade of the 1900s to enclose tea samples in silk and send them out to his customers, with the idea being that they would open the bag of silk and put the tea into their teapot. But what happened was customers threw the whole thing in the teapot. They didn't take it out of the silk bag, and thus the tea bag was invented. What a change, what a revolutionary idea the tea bag is. And what has it led to? It's led to many, many people trying tea that might not otherwise. So it's tempting to see that as a good thing, a bit like old Si and his horse when it came back. But most of the tea that's grown in tea bags is grown in places like Kenya and Malawi, where the workers have terrible, terrible conditions. They're basically paid a starvation wage. It's enough money to keep you alive a bit longer. It's not enough money to live. And you can do all sorts of comparisons and look at the living standards and whatever, but at the end of the day, most tea work in these places is seasonal. People leave their villages for 6 or 8 months a year. They've got no money, they've got no entertainment, they've got no electricity, they're lucky if they've got drinkable water, they've got little food, AIDS is rampant. It's a horrific situation that most of us in the West really can't relate to. And so the big question you've got to ask yourself is, am I going to perpetuate this by buying tea bag tea? Or am I going to say to myself, I may be contributing 1/160th of the supermarket price to the welfare of these workers, and it's not enough, but are they going to be worse off if I don't buy this tea? And that's a matter for you. But in the blend you have in front of you, I got one of these English breakfast tea bags, and I ripped it up and I added it to the blend. It has no taste. There's no taste. It doesn't add taste. But what I hope it adds is a thought. I hope it adds the thought that says, we're very, very lucky, and as I drink any fine cup of tea, I should spare a thought for those people that were involved in bringing it to me, because some of them have done well and made a lot of money, and some of them haven't. That applies for most tea, but particularly the tea bag teas. Excuse me while I sip some tea. In the 1700s, there was enormous taxes on tea in England, and taxation and tea is something that you may have heard of, being American, or I anticipate the audience being mostly American. And I think one of the things we need to think about is the idea of the tea smuggler, because with excise on tea being up to about 120%, it's estimated that in the first half of the 18th century, up to 93% of the tea in England was smuggled. And it's a very romantic notion, the tea smuggler. There's plenty of descriptions in contemporary literature of the upper class or upper middle class or upper lower class, or wherever you want to put it, person of some means holding a little bag of money out of their window, and that bag is gently taken from their hand and replaced with a packet of tea, because it wouldn't be seen with these smugglers, and you'd have to be able to deny ever seeing a smuggler, but this is how it used to work. So we have this romantic Robin Hood notion of these smugglers that bravely fight against the British government's excessive taxation. And I'm sure that's an idea that appeals in America as it does in Australia. This idea of the outlaw being a hero. But then you can read the transcripts of the trial of Mr. Kingsmill and others who conspired to bring tea into the country, and at one point a boat full of their tea was intercepted off the coast, and Captain Johnson on that boat bought all their tea. There was a little bit of brandy and port, but mostly tea, 300 bags of it, into the customs house at Poole in Dorset, where it was locked up for the night. And Mr. Kingsmill and his cronies, who were known as the Hawkhurst gang, got together with some other smugglers and decided they would take the tea back. And to do that, they would break into the customs house. And when they got there, they found that the naval ship that had picked it up was sitting off the bay with its guns pointed at the customs house, perhaps having been tipped off. And so what they did was, they waited till the tide went out, and the boat went further and further out. And once they were free of the range of those guns, they smashed down the door and stole the tea, or took back the tea. That's a wonderful tale of daring do and adventure. But a man called Diamond was amongst the group, and as they rode through Fordingbridge in Hampshire, a local shoemaker recognised Mr. Diamond and mentioned it to someone who happened to be a constable. And he was assigned another man, and they were asked to ride off to a nearby town and place a deposition with the court. And so these two men, Chater and Galley, went off, and they stopped at an alehouse where they had a bit to drink, and some smugglers who were associated with the gang figured out who they were and what they were up to, and got them drunk, and over the next 3 days tortured and bludgeoned them to death. One was beaten to death, one was thrown into a well after being beaten, and they threw a whole stack of stuff down on top of him. So again, we have this idea of these heroes are villains. What's good is bad, what's bad is good. And the tea that they brought in was Bohea. Bohea used to mean the finest of black Chinese teas. These days it tends to mean a fairly low-grade tea. So I actually went to a local Chinese merchant and bought Bohea. This is what it is, it's chunky. This is what it is these days. Back then, with such massive taxation, the smugglers could actually afford to bring in some pretty decent tea. And often it would be brought in legitimately into places like Holland, and then it would be just smuggled across the channel. You know, a few miles, there you go, cheap tea, good tea. And the Hawkhurst gang were rounded up and hung. But it did lead to a change in taxation, and that led to two things. One is, it led directly to the Boston Tea Party, and the other thing it led to was the replacement of a tax on tea with a tax on windows by the British government, which is why so many buildings from that period of English history have got very small windows, because you paid by the size. So there you go, another story. I'd like to finish on a semi-positive note with reflection. And the thing is that there are many governments around the world, most notably the Indian government, that have made massive strides in trying to improve the lot of the tea worker. And they have government inspectors now that go around to the different tea plantations and ensure that everyone is being treated properly, and the law says that the workers' children must be educated, there must be schools and doctors and electricity and running water and all these things. And so thousands and thousands of tea plantations in India have now got a great standard of living for some of the people compared to the nearby surrounding. In Assam, the local indigenous people are often seen as being of a very low class, and a lot of exploitation still goes on. And sadly, the government inspectors are on occasion given a stack of money to look the other way. So, should the government of India have instituted this program of reform? Well, of course it should have. And is it successful? Yes, but what, in 50%, 60%, 70%, 23%, 93% of cases? We don't know. But they must try. Because everywhere in the world where we have tea, we must try to improve the lot of these workers. So the last tea that I've included in reflection is a Harmati estate, Assam. It's a beautiful malty Assam tea, and the thing I like about it is I know that the workers at that garden are treated well. So next time you drink a cup of tea, whether it be a cup of reflection or an English breakfast tea bag or a fine Thai Gwyn, it doesn't really matter. Whatever you have, think about it. Think about the person that served it to you, the person you're with, the person that picked it, the person that shipped it. Because a cup of tea is a fantastic time for reflection. I'll see you in a minute, then I'll